Hello, everyone. I'm Jessica Manriquez Jewell, President and CEO at California Rural Legal Assistance, Inc., also known as CRLA. And I'm here today with Carol Ruth Silver. I want to thank you, Carol Ruth, for being in conversation with me today. I have a very brief bio that I wanted to read about you because there's so much to say, but I try to shorten it as much as possible. So, Carol Ruth Silver, you are a trailblazing civil rights activist and attorney. You joined CRLA's inaugural staff in 1966 as our first female attorney and founder of the McFarland Delano office. Before that, you were a freedom rider. You were jailed in Mississippi for challenging segregation. You went on to serve 12 years on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, right? Working alongside Harvey Milk. Across your remarkable career, you have championed civil rights, education, justice here at home and abroad. And you continue to work today through philanthropy and advocacy, right? And so I'm just thrilled to get a chance to talk to you because you have such an incredible story. I want to just dive right in to the work that you did with CRLA. You mentioned you're an alumni of CRLA. I'm so excited to get to hear about what that was like those early years. So why don't you start by telling me about what first brought you to CRLA? What was going on in your life back then? What drove you here?
Well, the year was 1965, and Johnson was president, and he decided, or the Congress decided, they were going to pass the 1965 Civil Rights Act. And in that, there was money appropriated for a whole variety of what became known as the War on Poverty, the opportunity for both former slaves and the descendants of former slaves, Black people in America, to gain economic opportunities. And one of the things that was proposed by lawyers was that include legal services for poor people. And CRLA was conceived by Jim Lorenz, who was then a hotshot lawyer in Los Angeles with a big hotshot law firm, as something for not just African Americans in the South, but for rural poor people in California and elsewhere. And so he wrote something called Legal Services for the Poor in California, or California Rural Legal Assistance. And that position paper was circulated among people like me I was then 2 years out of law school, and we glommed onto it and said, yes, 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 this is the right thing to do. Particularly, Jim brought that memo to Gary Bello, who was then a very prominent legal services person in Washington, D.C. And Lorenz and Bello then recruited a whole bunch of people, but in particular me, who had worked on getting the legal services for the poor into the 1965 Civil Rights Bill. And I had my position in all of that was that I was an intern in North Carolina working for Floyd Bixler McKissick, a Black lawyer in North Carolina. And he, a great visionary, had said, yes, 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 we have to see that the Civil Rights Bill, the 1965 Civil Rights Act, includes legal services for the poor. And so he sent me up to Washington to join with Gary and Jim and other people who were lobbying for the inclusion of legal services for the poor in the 1965 Civil Rights Act, which we succeeded in doing.
Wow.
We were all over the Congress. We were in the door of every congressman, of every senator. We worked very hard to get that in, and the minute that we got it in, CRLA's application was probably the first one that was considered, because Jim and Gary and I and others had been so active in trying to get the legislation passed. But Jim Lorenz's memo outlining why rural poor people in California needed legal services for the poor was top of the pile. And so we got it.
That's incredible. I knew you had a role in writing the application for funding and getting CRLA started, but that's incredible to hear all the work that you did in the halls of Congress to get the funding and get not just impacting CRLA, but so many other legal services across the country.
That's true.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. You're welcome. It has been a great point of pride in my life.
Yeah, see, I knew it was going to be incredible. And question number one, I'm already starstruck. So let's wow me some more. Tell me about those early years at CRLA, because you dove right into the work. It was a lot of work was around the farm worker movement. You got to work alongside of Dolores Huerta, Larry Itliong, Cesar Chavez. And the epicenter of a lot of that work was Delano, was McFarland, where you were leading that office. So how did it feel to lead that office in such a pivotal moment?
Well, pivotal is the right term, and I'm glad to hear when you recite the names of the people who were pivotal in the grape strike, in the movement in the farm workers movement, that you mentioned Larry Itliong, who was the Filipino leader, the leader of the Filipino farm workers, who actually initiated the grape strike. It was Larry, not Caesar, but when Larry brought that idea to Caesar, Caesar glommed onto it, and Caesar and Dolores and all of the people in the Mexican American farm worker movement became involved, and Larry was right there with Caesar, and he was particularly my friend of all the people that were there. So you asked, what was it like? The first thing that happened after I was told by Gary and Jim, okay, your job is to go to Delano and start the first CRLA office in the Central Valley. And I said, okay. And I jumped in my little car and I took off for Delano. By the time I got to Delano, I was in, and this is before cell phones. You have to remember the limitations of our lives in those days. No cell phones, no copiers, no computers. This is 1966. By the time I got to Delano and made a phone call at a payphone back to Los Angeles, where Gary and Jim were having their office, they had already been told by the legal services people in Washington. In fact, it was Clint Bamberger who was appointed by Johnson to run the legal services program. I think he was already in office. We could not have an office in Delano. We mustn't have anything that had the Delano return address on it. So I said, well, what are we going to do? And Jim or Gary, whoever it was, said, well, drive around and find another little town near Delano so that we can have an office that serves the farm workers who are in Delano, but that doesn't have a return address of Delano, California. So I did in my little car. I drove around and I found I found the town of McFarland, and I drove around in McFarland and I found an office for rent that was newly constructed. It does probably now doesn't look very new, but it was then newly constructed. It was clean. It was, I don't think it had, ADA had not been passed. So it didn't have an elevator and didn't have to comport with the ADA, but it was comfortable. It was large enough. It was just right. And so I negotiated with the landlord. I didn't tell him what we were going to do in this place that he was going to rent to us. And I got the office. I got desks. I got secondhand furniture. I hired a secretary who was a Spanish-speaking former legal secretary. I guess she was then a legal secretary from one of the law offices, one of the lawyers in Delano or McFarland, and we were off and running.
And open the doors to help everyone that needed your help back then. That's incredible. Yes. Tell me more about this. It can't have a Delano address. You were facing some incredible political pressures in this work. So
yes,
you want to elaborate on that? That's fascinating.
Well, the political pressure was that the Congress people from Delano, from rural California, hated the farm workers. They employed the farm workers. They had an incredible. They were frightened, and they were correct that they were in the wrong and they were doing bad things to their own employees. I mean, things like the short-handled hoe. I'll talk about that as a case, but things like they didn't put any bathrooms, any porta potties in the fields. So where did they expect these farm workers to do their business?
Right.
Well, on your lettuce, that's where it was, and on your broccoli. And so when those things were harvested and had to be sent to stores in all over the world, they had to have a, please be sure to rinse this agricultural product from not from Delano, but from the Central Valley of California. So that was part of the problem. Was that not part of the problem? The whole problem with locating our office, CRLA's office, not in Delano, was because the farm owners, the growers, didn't want to be tagged with people coming from Delano. Delano became the watchword all over the country. People relatives of mine in Massachusetts had not tasted a grape until the farm workers' strike was settled, had complained that they had not tasted a grape for umpteen years. It took years before the farm workers' strike was successfully over. And but people across the United States, in sympathy for the farm workers, were boycotting grapes. And the people who owned the grape yards and who owned the orchards and the ground and where agricultural workers were working, hated the notion that here these people who they had screwed over in a variety of different ways. No bathrooms was one. Working in the hot sun with no breaks, another. No fresh water being made available. The short-handled hoe. All these things, all these growers had been really abusing their agricultural workers. Mostly they were Mexican or other South American people who had come across the Rio Grande, just as they still have been since then. But because they had no lawyers, because there was nobody looking at what was going on, there were these terrible things that were happening to them. So CRLA shows up, and we send a lawyer into the fields. They send, not me. I was too short, and I was a girl, and nobody thought that girl lawyers. There was a certain disdain for lady lawyers, but one of the first things I did was, in addition to hiring a hotshot Spanish-speaking legal secretary, was to hire Gil Lopez, who was 6 foot tall and built, and he went into the fields, and he went down into the farm work places where farm workers were working, and he talked to them in Spanish, and he came back with a list of all the terrible things that were happening to them. And I, sitting in my nice little office in McFarland, I wrote them up. Then I had my secretary type them up, and they became a complaint, which then went to the federal court. And we started filing cases saying, hey, this grower has failed to, and there were laws. The state of California did have laws like you have to provide bathrooms, or not bathrooms, what do you call porta potties, or some opportunity for farm workers to do their business. There were laws, and most of the growers were not following the laws, and that's what lawyers do.
Yeah.
They write up the problem, then they go to the court, and they say, hey, Your Honor, this particular grower is doing bad things. We want money. We want an injunction. We want news coverage of it. We sent out press releases. Every time we filed a lawsuit, we sent out press release.
Love it.
We loved it. Yes, exactly. And we were doing the Lord's work. There's no question about that. These people, the farm workers in California, had never had any kind of representation. Nobody even thought of them. Nobody thought of, where do our vegetables come from? And CRLA made it an important part of the civil rights movement. I was involved in the civil rights movement in Jackson, Mississippi. I got arrested there, but the civil rights movement didn't even know about farm workers in California.
Right.
Nobody even talked about them. Nobody thought about them. And there were almost no Hispanics in the civil rights movement in Alabama, in Mississippi, and places like that until CRLA.
Yeah, it's amazing. So CRLA was here. They started noticing these problems and amplifying the problems
Yes,
that the farm workers were experiencing, and you were filing cases left and right.
absolutely.
Love it.
Absolutely.
I want to go back because, I can only imagine the political pressure you were facing, but I want to go back to something you mentioned about lady lawyers.
Oh,
That's something else I'm very curious to hear, because in addition to the political pressure, you were also experiencing being the only woman leading an office at CRLA. You were probably the only lady lawyer, woman attorney in a lot of spaces. What was that dynamic? What are some of the challenges you faced, and how did you overcome those?
I'm not sure I overcame those challenges, but the challenges were absolutely real. One of my strongest recollections of being in Kern County, so both Delano and McFarland are in the county of Kern, which was, and the reason that the farm workers were there is because that is kind of the cross point of people migrating. Migrant workers came through Delano, and they picked up their jobs, and they were working there. So I was a young lawyer. I was 2 years or 2 years out of law school. And I said to myself, oh, I should join the local bar association. And the local bar association was the Kern County Bar. And there were, I don't know, maybe a few hundred lawyers in Kern. It was not a big location. So I joined, and then they sent me a notice that there was going to be a meeting. And so I said, okay, I jumped in my little car and I drove from McFarland to Bakersfield, where these kind of meetings were going to be happening. And I parked and I walked into this, probably a hotel room. I don't remember exactly where, but in this room that I walked into, there were maybe 30, 40, 50 lawyers, and they were all chitting and chatting and in small groups. And there was one other lady lawyer that I found out later was a representative of one of the big growers.
Oh.
She worked for the growers. But I, as one does when you enter a group of people who are standing around chitting and chatting, I kind of walked up to a group. And as I did that, this group of men closed the opening of their little chat group and made it impossible for me to join. So I kind of recoiled and I said, oh, well, and I went away from that little group and I went to another little group. The same thing happened. They came together and made it impossible for me to be a member of the group. And I was a dues-paying member already of the Kern County Bar Association. I'd sent in my check or whatever. So I said, I'm not going to be treated this way. And I turned around and I started to mosey out the door. And as I did, there was a woman lawyer standing near there. And I said, gee, to her, something along the lines of, this is not a very friendly place. And she said to me something along the lines of, we don't like your kind. We don't want you here. And I left.
Wow.
But that was the first time that was the first time that I had ever experienced that kind of hostility at the level of lawyers. Hostility from growers, from the supervisors in agricultural places. Get out! You can't be here. Take your flyers and flyers that said, come and we'll evaluate your cases. This lady lawyer laid it on the line. She said, we don't want you here. And I'm sure that was true for her and for her boss and for the people that were oppressing, really. I don't mean to overstate it, but who were oppressing the farm workers who came to work in their fields without whom they would not be able to harvest their crops. They were I'm tearing up. I'm sorry. They were oppressing these people, these farm workers. And, and I recited some of the things that were being done to them. Not only those things, but child labor.
Yeah.
They were allowing the farm workers to bring their children as young as however long the children were not being put into school. There were no schools, and there were schools, but the kids had to go to the schools. And if they go to the schools, then they wouldn't be in the fields picking peaches or tomatoes or whatever they picked. So avoiding the California child labor laws was another big issue that we complained about
Yeah.
in court.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yes.
And so Kern Bar didn't want you there. Growers didn't want you
The growers didn't want me there.
But farm workers definitely wanted you there. And the
Yes.
other thing I keep hearing is that a lot of lawyers wanted to be there too. When I talk to others who have worked at CRLA in the past, they always talk about how Delano was the place to be. It was the office to work in. And even though you were dealing with all that conflict and pressure, and you were still filing all these righteous cases.
Oh yeah, we were so happy whenever we got somebody. I mean, it sounds funny, but Gil Flores and other farm worker associates, we called them community workers. Every once in a while, I'd be sitting at my desk and doing paperwork and so forth, and somebody would come in and they had in tow a genuine farm worker with his wife and his little kids, and they were very fearful because they were going to the office of a lawyer, and lawyers had a bad rep in those days. But I and the other farm workers, the other community workers, we were, yay, come on in. We've got some papers for you to look at.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the community worker, because that, I think, has always been such an incredible aspect of the way CRLA does work. I actually started at CRLA as a community worker myself.
Okay.
And so can you tell us more about what the thought was with having community workers as part of the staff?
Oh, yes. I've got a lot to say on that subject. I have, when I was sent to CRLA to find an office, found the office in Delano, in McFarland, started out, I had a desk, I had a chair, and I had a telephone, and that was about it. I had no other lawyer in the office. I hired a secretary, and then I hired Gil and other community workers. But there were no other legal personnel. There was no assistant, no paralegals. Yes, no paralegals. There was nobody else. There was just me. I was the lawyer of CRLA in that setting, and that lasted for about 2 years.
Oh.
And I, at some point, I called Jim Lorenz, and my recollection is that it was like 3 a.m. And I called, and I used to work.
And you were still at the office.
I was still at the office, and because papers had to be filed, and I called Jim Lorenz and I said, Jim, I've had it. I can't do this anymore. You have to get me out of here, and bring in another lawyer to replace me. And he said, you know what? I understand. I'm going to work on it the next in the morning, and we'll get you out of there in a very short time. And he did, and he replaced me in CRLA McFarland Delano. He replaced me with Gary Bello and 4 Reggies. Reginald Heber Smith Fellows were a high level internship that was created by the Legal Services program. And CRLA, most legal services programs around the country, got 1 Reggie or 2 at the most. CRLA had a whole bunch of them because we were the hot shots.
Yeah, you really were.
And Gary and 4 Reggies came to replace me. Gary Bello, who was then the second in command in CRLA. He wasn't just one more Reggie. He was, and he was a brilliant lawyer. He was absolutely brilliant and wonderful. And he and 4 of the Reggies came up, including Jerry Cohen,
Oh, wow.
who came as a Reggie, but almost immediately disappeared and started going in daily to Cesar Chavez and Larry
Yeah.
Leong's office over in Delano. So we had 3. But anyway, I almost immediately threw my stuff in the car and took off and left. And I don't think I've been back to Delano since. No, I did go by a couple of times, but I was so glad to get out of there.
Oh.
It was so awful. I mean, it was awful in the sense that it was 60 hours a week when in a good week, and 80 hours if it wasn't good. And I was really exhausted.
Yeah.
But talking about what did we do at CRLA that was so extraordinary. Yes, we filed these lawsuits. We filed the Bob Gnazda was particularly active in the short-handled hoe case. I don't want to take any of his glory, but we all participated in that. And I was particularly interested in the Wasco water case, which is another case. But the lowest level thing that happens in legal services for the poor is the thousands of poor people who have very simple problems, like I can't get a driver's license because I had tickets and I didn't pay my tickets, and now I have thousands of dollars worth of demand from the DMV, so I can't get a driver's license. So if I can't get a driver's license, I can't drive, or I'm not supposed to drive, but of course I have to drive, and so I get tickets for driving without a license. That was one. The other one was divorce. Hundreds of farm workers were involved in relationships. They got married, and then those didn't work out, and they wanted to get divorced so they could marry their next lady friend or whatever, and they couldn't do that because to get a divorce in California at that time meant you had to do a set of papers which somebody had to type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you had to go to a hearing. And in that hearing, you had to say, I hereby testify that the relationship has become untenable and I want to get divorced. Well, all of that took lawyers to do basic paperwork. And so I, together with some other people, said, why don't we just mimeograph the pleadings for these divorces? They're all the same. Everybody has the same story. The relationship has deteriorated. We have kids. I want to have the wife have half the assets. I want to have the children be able to see both father and mother. And I wrote up a standard divorce pleading. Now, as lawyers know, at that time, you had to type each and every one of those divorce pleadings by itself. Then you had to attach other papers and so forth. But by my mimeographed pleadings, which had blanks for the name of the plaintiff, the name of the defendant, the name of the wife, the name of the husband, the names of the children, I was able to file hundreds of divorce cases. And the Bar Association went crazy because they said, you're taking money away from the lawyers. You're ruining the bar. And the Bar Association of Kern County went to Ronald Reagan, who was then the governor of California, and tried to get me disbarred. They said she's acting unethically because she's using these form pleadings.
For being too efficient.
Well, as you and every other person who now goes to court in California or anywhere in the country knows, from my mimeographed pleadings grew all of the forms that are used by every court in California. Every divorce case that anybody files starts out with a form from the court, and you can't just file. Maybe you can. I've never tried, but anybody who wants to file a divorce, even if it's for $1 million properties and $1 million actors and so forth, they start with a simple pleading that has a place for the name of the plaintiff, a place for the name of the defendant. And that was really the beginning of form pleadings. And we had form pleadings. I had a form pleading for divorce. That was the most popular one. I had a form pleading for bankruptcy. That was popular also. I had a form pleading for challenging a defective, like a lemon car. I had a form pleading for any of the most common of the poor people's cases. And why that was important, why that was particularly important, was because before California Rural Legal Assistance, before the 1965 legislation that created legal services for the poor, for poor people, the people didn't do those things. People just suffered. They suffered in a case of divorce. They suffered not being able to marry the person with whom they now were living and had children and so forth. And there were many things that were really sad. But we did that. And once we had begun to use those form pleadings, even though they tried to get me disbarred, they never got. The Judicial Council did not take them very seriously. Kern County Bar Association did not have many friends in Sacramento, although their grower friends did. But I kind of think that the growers and their lawyers were not necessarily talking to each other about things like disbarring one precocious lady lawyer, McFarland.
Yeah, I love that. Judicial Council, instead of disbarring you, we're like, maybe she's onto something. Let's all do fillable forms.
Let's do forms.
Love that. I have no idea that you were to thank for the fillable forms that we use every single day.
Well, not me. There were other people as well. I can't remember his name, but a guy who made a huge amount of money, who became the form. He was selling these forms. He took my forms and other people's forms and he was selling them to lawyers. This is before the internet, before everything. But he would advertise in the in the newspaper for lawyers, and get your forms here. And lawyers would get them and say, "Oh yeah, I can do this."
Yeah.
And so that was a very, very important part. And therefore I was going to say, before legal services for the poor, lawyers had legal services programs. They had legal aid. They had it was called legal aid. And every time that somebody opened a legal aid office and got lawyers and raised money, the minute that they opened their office, they would be inundated with all these old cases, particularly divorce cases, because that was, everybody had a divorce case. They would be overwhelmed with divorce cases. And since they didn't have any way of doing what I was doing, which is to make it easy to do the paperwork, and then when the cases were coming up for hearing, I would schedule 5 or 10 of these divorce cases in the Superior Court of Kern County, and I would march in with my files and my clients, and they'd sit, and when their case was called, we'd all go up, and they'd get their divorce and be gone. And the other lawyers came in with one case and their client, said, "How come she's doing this?"
Yeah.
And for cheap and for nothing. Why am I paying you $600 to file these papers and take me to court when it can be done for nothing?
Yeah, love that. And I want to go back to what we were talking about community and the community that you were building around you, despite the lack of support from many others in the community. But we always say at CRLA, we always say justice starts with community, because we really pride ourselves and have that deep commitment to making sure that the work that we do is really client-led and community-led. And that, what we're working on is really activating the power that already exists in with our clients and with the communities that we serve. I'm curious, how did that show up for you during your time at CRLA?
Well, my contacts with the farm worker community were either at the highest level when I went over to where Cesar and Larry and Dolores Huerta and the staff and the important people in the farm worker strike were planning and plotting, and they would ask me, if I do this, can I get arrested? And I would say yes, for sure. If you are trespassing on the land of some grower, can I get arrested? Yes. Can you get me out? Yes. But it takes money, and we have to raise some money. But also, I was, so that was the highest level of who was there, but the lowest level was through the community workers. And these people who were a month away from having been picking grapes, or picking, not so much grapes, but peaches and tomatoes, and a lot of tomatoes, and vegetables in the fields. They would invite me to come to their house for a dinner, and or to bring their kids over to interpret for them if one of the community workers wasn't there, and that was very satisfying. It made up for all those people in Kern County who didn't want me to be there. So I enjoyed, particularly my legal secretary was really very kind to me, and Gil and other community workers. But because there was no other lawyer in the office, my hours were from early morning until late at night. And I had to, even though I had these forms, I had to read them and make sure that they were being filled out correctly, in English, not in Spanish, even though the people that were being represented, the clients, were all Spanish speakers, didn't speak almost any English. And so Gil would take their information and write it in, and make a draft on one of my forms, and then I would have to take that draft and make sure that it was in the right places, that the language was correct, and so forth, so that he could take it down to Bakersfield, go to the clerk's office, pay the fee to file it, $25 or something like that, and get it on the calendar. And I had to teach him how to do those things in order to get on the calendar. And then I could go down with a bunch of people and get their divorces for them. Yeah. So each of those things took time, and took my time and energy. So there wasn't a lot of time I didn't get to go to many parties. I got invited to a lot of weddings and parties and commencement, what do you call it, confirmation
Yeah.
parties, but I didn't get to go to a lot of them.
Yeah. It sounds like a lot of sacrifice and a lot of long hours.
A lot of long,
Which is why it
hours.
took Gary Bellows and 4 Reggies to replace you.
Yes, I love that. I love that story.
Yeah, that's been a highlight of this discussion for sure. So I said it sounds like a lot of sacrifice, and you were no stranger to sacrifices when
Yeah.
you came to CRLA. So I recently read your book, The Freedom Writer's Diary, where you share about your experiences being in prison, having been arrested for challenging segregation in the South. I was so inspired, and it's awesome to sit here chatting with you and just imagining what I read in your book, imagining you experiencing all of that. You gave a lot of personal sacrifice in those moments, and I was so inspired by the personal convictions that you shared and talking about why not me and why not do this, and just the reflections that you shared with readers in that book. You took such great personal risk through that experience, and so I was curious, what did you bring from that experience to your time with CRLA? How did that experience in the civil rights movement carry you forward through the rest of your career?
Well, I think you put it correctly. My experience in the civil rights movement carried me through my time at CRLA, my time at law school when I was busy. I wasn't as busy at my schoolwork as I ought to have been. I was instead writing briefs with law students to send down to African American lawyers in the South so as to help them handle civil rights cases in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Louisiana, Georgia, and the other places down there. But how did I get involved? People usually ask, why did you do this? How did you get involved in the civil rights movement? And I'm sure you've heard of, everybody's heard of the 10 Commandments, right? Mm-hmm. Well, in Judaism, there are 613 commandments.
Wow.
And most of them are picky and are not followed by many people. Some people try to follow all of them, but not me. But there's one that I really absorbed, and that was called Tikkun Olam. And Tikkun Olam is a Hebrew phrase that means, like Nike, just do it. It means whatever is wrong in the world, in your life, in where you are, it's up to you to fix it. Mm-hmm. It's up to you as a member of the human race to see what's wrong and to try your best to fix what's wrong. And it's often said, it's not your obligation to finish the work, but you cannot resist, you cannot fail to do the work, to begin the work, to try and make things better. And so with that as a foundational philosophy or religious commandment, if you will, I tried. And I am happy to say I'm 87 years old now, and I will go to meet my maker, as they say in the South. I love the Southern expressions around religion. When I go to meet my maker, I will say, yes, I did. I helped make the world a better place.
You really did, Carol. Thank you so much. And I love that you said the work is never finished. So what do you have to say for all of us that are still in the fight for justice, that, many will continue beyond us? What are the things that we can learn from that civil rights movement and from all of the other experiences you've had to continue that fight today?
You said it right. The work is never finished. The work of bringing justice to the world is never finished. I'm continuing to work in political campaigns, no matter what the issue, that will bring justice to the people.
Yeah, wonderful. And I want to mention Tupac, who's one of my favorite songs is "Changes" by Tupac. Are you a Tupac fan? No, because you mentioned the war on poverty, and one of his songs has a line that says, "Instead of a war on poverty, they have a war on drugs, so the police can bother me."
Yes,
And I was
that's right.
so that listen to that song every single day. And when you mentioned the war on poverty, it made me think about the fact that you've had the chance to work in social justice under both theories, under both policies, the war on poverty and then the war on drugs in the 70s to the present. How did those shift in policies and the way that we think about tackling justice and tackling the problems of the world, how has that impacted you and your career?
Well, as you may know, one of the last jobs I had as a lawyer before I packed it in and retired was as the head of the San Francisco Sheriff's Department legal service program for prisoners, for civil people who were incarcerated in the San Francisco civil city jail or county jail. And my job as the head of this program, and I had a bunch of lawyers who were volunteers working with me, and this was in the 80s, so it was long after CRLA, and where I had been the one and only lawyer. Now I had a bunch of lawyers working on it, and I found that people who were in my jail, in the San Francisco County Jail, mostly were there for drug offenses. Mostly were there because, and particularly in the women's jail, they were there because their boyfriend or their friend or somebody had drugs, and they were dragged in at the same time and wound up going to jail because of that. And because they were women and because they were poor, they were mostly mothers. And one of the things that happened to them in the jail is that I was asked, as the lawyer who was supposed to be helping them, to help them sign papers, help them to create a form for them to sign that would allow their children to be placed in foster care, or to be or to allow their children to be fostered or given over to a relative, to have the authority, a parental authority over that child or children. And I knew statistically that most of those women who signed those papers to give somebody else the right to exercise in loco parentis, that is, to be in the position of a parent to those children, would never, ever see their children again, because they had taken a probation or a parole, or they had taken something that held over their heads a long stint in the federal or in the state penitentiary. And while they were there, statistically, it was likely that somebody would come to them long after I was out of the picture and say, you know, your child is going into first grade or third grade and needs to have a stable home, and you're not going to get out of jail for another 5 years or so. Why don't you give us the opportunity to place her in an adoption setting So she would go to foster care, and then she would be adopted by this new family, and you would not have the opportunity to see her again. But when she got to be 18, when she got to be an adult, we would give her the information about you, the mother of this child, and you would have the opportunity at that time of contacting her. And I knew that that was just not going to happen, and that these mothers of children in my jail were going to be bereft of their children. I held that job for about a year, and I was more and more, I was becoming disillusioned with what I was doing. And I finally said, I can't be a part of this system anymore.
Yeah.
The war on drugs is evil, it is bad, and it is not something that I'm going to continue in. And so I quit my job and I retired.
Yeah. You retired and kept working on really wonderful justice work.
I did. I found other places that were easier to justify my using my still considerable energy and talents.
Yeah. And I appreciate that you called it this unjust system, because that's so much of the work that we do at CRLA is challenging these unjust systems. And so as we continue those efforts, what's your advice to current CRLA advocates?
Just do it.
I love that.
Yes, it's hard work, and somebody has to do it. And if you are an intern for CRLA, if you're a community worker, if you have taken the step of saying, I'm taking responsibility for the world, and I want to make this a place where I'm willing to bring children into the world, where I'm willing to say, we can do better, just do it.
Love it. How do you keep up that energy for it, especially in those moments where the world is so hard and there are so many things going on around us?
Well,
How do you
right now
keep
it's
safe?
particularly difficult.
Right.
I have to say, I am finding the world a very difficult place to exist in, without naming any names. But I can't tell you except that the more I think about my children and my grandchildren and how they will look back on my life and their own lives, the more I am committed to making it possible for them to understand, as young people, to understand that it's their responsibility to make things better, whether it's giving tzedakah, which is charity in the Jewish religion, or whether it is helping some old lady like me to cross the street when I'm jaywalking. Whatever the issue is, there is a responsibility to make things better and to do what has to be done.
So when you look back at your career, do you feel CRLA changed you as a person?
It was the first major success that came along in the legal services world. It was amazing that we were able to get that legislation through in the 1965 Civil Rights Act. It was amazing that Clint Bamberger and Jim Lorenz and Gary Bello were able to get funding for, when you think about it, for rural farm workers. Most people in the United States didn't even know that there were farm workers in America. They went to the grocery store, they bought broccoli, they bought lettuce. They didn't even think about how that got there to the grocery store. And we were able to do that. And then I was able to get an office. I was able to find somebody that, because I didn't tell him we were going to put the CRLA office there, but we were able to rent an office. We were able to do this. We were able to do that. We were able to do my forms that I still cherish, walking into a court in Kern County with 5 or 6 litigants, 5 or 6 divorcing couples, and having each one go up on the to the witness box and say, "Yes, I want a divorce." That's all that it took. You know, the law in California had made divorce simple, but you had to have a lawyer. You had to have somebody, or me with my forms, communicate that to the court. And then once the court saw that, yes, these people have answered all these questions, yes, divorce. And that was, all of these things were at some level magical. At some level, they were amazing that they happened, and happened to me.
Yeah. And you made a lot of that possible.
And I
so
made a
thank
lot
you.
of that possible, and I am so proud
Yeah.
of myself.
You should be. I love it. You know, I wish we could chat all day, but we have to start wrapping up. So I wanted to close with, because I'm so amazed by your story and the fact that you've accomplished so much as a lady lawyer. What advice would you give that next wave of women leaders in legal aid and social justice movements?
I think one of the things that I would say to the women who are coming behind is, you're the majority. Don't forget it. There are more women than there are men in this world. Not by a lot, but and men are still useful. We need them, but don't let don't let yourself be intimidated ever. Not by the muscles, not by the fact that they can whack a tennis ball further. Don't be afraid. Don't be intimidated. You have the superpower of being a woman. You have the hormones, you have the DNA, you have the motherhood, you have the responsibility, you have the ability. You, women, have the ability to make this world a much better place. Look at all these guys with their wars and all this. Never mind. Don't be pulled into being masculine. Don't be pulled into thinking that you have to emulate the men who have screwed up this world in lots of different ways. You have the superpower to make it better.
Thank you, Carol Ruth. I love that. I'm going to carry that with me for sure. So thank you for spending the time with me this morning. It was incredible to talk to you. Like I said, I've been so inspired by you and your book, your stories, and to get to sit and chat with you has been a total honor. So I really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your questions and your patience. Sometimes I get carried away. Very nice to have this interview. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.